The Ivy Chelsea Garden, London, SW3. It's a cold February evening when James Ashworth, property magnate worth $200 million, orders the waitress to call the police to arrest a customer who dared complain about the service. The arrogance in his piercing blue eyes is palpable as he declares, "Nobody tells me no in my establishment." But Emma Thompson, a 26-year-old waitress with 2 university degrees and the broken dream of opening her own gastropub, doesn't lower her gaze. What happens when she leans towards him and whispers something in his ear leaves the entire luxury restaurant speechless. A millionaire who believes he owns the world is about to discover that there are things money simply cannot buy. James Ashworth owned London piece by piece, building by building, like a giant Monopoly game where he'd bought every property on the board. At 42, his property empire was worth $200 million and continued growing daily. Glass towers in Canary Wharf, Georgian townhouses in Belgravia, luxury flats in Kensington. His signature was stamped across half the capital. But his most precious kingdom was the Ivy Chelsea Garden, the Michelin-starred restaurant he'd acquired 3 years earlier in the heart of Chelsea. Not out of culinary passion, but to own another symbol of his power. A place where London's elite came to see and be seen, where dinner cost an average monthly salary, and where James could sit at his reserved corner table like an emperor on his throne. This February evening, the restaurant gleamed like a crown jewel. Waterford crystal chandeliers hung from the ornate ceiling. Crisp white tablecloths covered marble tables. Sterling silver cutlery reflected the soft candlelight. Every detail screamed luxury, every element chosen to impress and intimidate. James sat at his corner table, the one with panoramic views of the dining room, wearing a $5,000 Savile Row suit that fitted him like a second skin. His steel-gray eyes surveyed the room with the expression of someone who owned everything he could see. Investment bankers, industrialists, celebrities from the BBC, all came to pay homage. All sought his favor. All knew that James Ashworth was a man you didn't cross. His arrogance was as legendary as his wealth. He didn't accept refusals, wouldn't tolerate objections, couldn't bear anyone questioning his authority. "Nobody tells me no," was his motto, repeated so often it had become the hallmark of his toxic personality. But tonight, whilst sipping a $1,000 bottle of Chateau d'Yquem, James didn't know he was about to meet the first person in his life who would tell him no. And it wouldn't be another millionaire, nor an influential politician, nor a media mogul. It would be Emma Thompson, the waitress who had served at his tables for 2 years, whilst remaining completely invisible to his eyes. Emma was 26, with 2 university degrees, business management from Cambridge and culinary arts from Le Cordon Bleu, London. Her dream was to open a small gastropub, a place where food would be made with love and people would feel at home. But dreams were expensive, and bank loans were hard to secure for a young woman without collateral. So Emma served tables for $7.50 an hour, smiling at customers who spent on one dinner what she earned in 3 months. She wore the black uniform with white apron, kept her auburn hair pulled back in an impeccable bun, and moved between tables with the silent grace of someone who knew how to be invisible. But Emma observed everything. She saw how the wealthy treated the poor, how power corrupted the soul, how arrogance grew proportionally to bank balances, and James Ashworth was the perfect example of everything she despised. A man who believed money gave him the right to trample on human dignity. The evening that would change everything began like any other. James sat at his table, surrounded by sycophants who hung on his every word. He'd just closed a $50 million deal for a skyscraper in the city and felt invincible. But invincibility, Emma knew, was often the prelude to a fall. Fate arrived in the form of a dissatisfied customer who dared complain about undercooked salmon. A minor error, easily fixable, which in any other restaurant would have been handled with a simple plate exchange. But James Ashworth wouldn't tolerate criticism of his property, and what he did next would trigger a reaction he hadn't anticipated. The dissatisfied customer was an elegant gentleman in his 50s who had ordered the pan-seared salmon. When the fish arrived, the cooking wasn't perfect. The flesh was still translucent in the center. A mistake that happens. A problem easily resolved. The gentleman discreetly called Emma over, and with utmost politeness pointed out the issue. He didn't raise his voice, didn't cause a scene, simply asked for the dish to be cooked properly. Emma nodded understandingly and headed to the kitchen to speak with the chef. But James Ashworth had observed the entire scene from his table. His eyes had narrowed watching the customer signal Emma, and when she'd approached to listen to the complaint, James's face had darkened like a storm cloud. Nobody dared criticize the Ivy Chelsea garden. Nobody dared question the quality of his restaurant. And especially, nobody dared spoil the atmosphere of his perfect evening with trivial complaints. James rose from his table with sharp movements, his face reddened by anger and wine. His guests watched him with concern, sensing the storm about to break. With determined steps, he crossed the dining room, each footfall echoing on the polished floor like a war drum. He arrived at the gentleman's table just as Emma returned from the kitchen with the chef's apologies and assurance that the dish would be remade immediately. But James had no intention of letting the situation resolve diplomatically. He stopped beside the table, towering over the seated man with his imposing height and intimidating presence. His voice, when he spoke, was so laden with contempt that all surrounding tables fell silent to listen. The conversation that followed was a crescendo of arrogance. James introduced himself as the owner and accused the man of commercial defamation over a simple observation about fish cookery. The gentleman tried to explain politely that there was no offensive intention, but James was already beyond control. The escalation reached its peak when James, accustomed to being obeyed without question, couldn't conceive that someone would dare criticize his property. His mind, clouded by ego and wine, interpreted a legitimate complaint as a personal attack on his prestige. That's when he ordered Emma to call the police to have the customer arrested for disturbing the peace and defamation. The absurdity of the demand was evident to all. Calling police over undercooked salmon bordered on the ridiculous. Emma stood motionless, the replacement dish still in her hands, eyes moving between James and the confused customer. The entire dining room was now silent, witnessing this surreal scene of gratuitous arrogance. James, seeing Emma's hesitation, raised his voice even higher, commanding her to call the police immediately. His tone brooked no argument. It was the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. It was at this moment that Emma made the decision that would change everything. She gently placed the plate on the table, straightened her back, and for the first time in 2 years, looked James Ashworth directly in the eyes. "No," she said in a calm but firm voice. The word fell into the dining room's silence, like a bomb. James stood paralyzed, convinced he'd misheard. Nobody, in 42 years of life, had ever told him no so directly, so publicly, so definitively. His voice, when he managed to speak, was a dangerous whisper that revealed his disbelief at facing rebellion he'd never experienced before. Emma took a step forward, approaching James until she was mere inches from his face. What she whispered in his ear was heard only by him, but the effect was devastating. James's face paled, his eyes widened, and for the first time in his life, London's most arrogant man was left speechless. Emma leaned slightly towards James, close enough that only he could hear her words, but visible enough for the entire dining room to witness the scene. The contrast was powerful. The humble waitress addressing the arrogant millionaire, simple uniform against luxury suit, calm against fury. What Emma whispered in James's ear was a lesson in dignity, condensed into a few cutting sentences. She explained that he might own the restaurant, but not the people in it, that money didn't buy the right to humiliate an innocent customer, that she was a free person who wouldn't execute unjust orders. The words struck James like icy slaps. Nobody in his adult life had ever spoken to him with this combination of respect and absolute firmness. These hadn't been words of defiance shouted or dramatic rebellion. They'd been spoken with the quiet dignity of someone who knew her own worth, regardless of bank balance. James stepped back, his face changing from red with anger to white with shock. His mind, accustomed to calculating profits and losses, couldn't process what was happening. A waitress had just stood up to him in front of a room full of witnesses. He stammered something about dismissal, but Emma replied serenely that she no longer wanted to work for someone who treated people like objects he owned. She turned to the customer who'd triggered the entire scene, assuring him his salmon would be ready in 5 minutes, cooked to perfection. James stood motionless, watching Emma head towards the kitchen with the same grace she'd served his tables for 2 years. But now that grace carried new dignity, an authority that had nothing to do with economic power. The restaurant's other patrons followed the scene with electric silence. Some hid approving smiles, others seemed shocked by the young woman's audacity. But all knew they'd witnessed something rare, a lesson in human dignity in a world where everything seemed to have a price. James tried to save face by ordering the customer to leave as well, but the gentleman rose calmly and with dignity. Before leaving, he stopped to say he'd dined in the finest restaurants worldwide, but had never seen an owner behave so rudely. His final words resonated through the dining room like a verdict. This girl was worth more than all of James's millions combined. Emma reappeared from the kitchen with the perfectly cooked salmon, but the customer had already left. She smiled and offered to serve the chef's specialty to other tables, transforming a moment of tension into a service opportunity, demonstrating that true professionalism had nothing to do with submission. James, completely bewildered, staggered back to his table.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
His guests watched him with expressions ranging from embarrassment to curiosity. The man who'd always dominated every situation had just been humiliated by a 26-year-old waitress. But the evening wasn't over. Emma still had something to say, and what she would do in the following minutes would leave an indelible mark on everyone present's memory. Emma finished her shift with impeccable professionalism, serving other tables as if nothing had happened. But each of her movements was different. She walked with her head higher, smiled with more warmth, spoke to customers with newfound confidence. It was as if defying James Ashworth had freed her from invisible chains she hadn't even known she wore. James, from his table, couldn't help but observe her. Initial anger gave way to something more complex, profound confusion about who this woman really was, someone who'd worked for him for 2 years whilst remaining completely invisible. When the restaurant began to empty, Emma approached James's table for the last time. His guests had left, leaving him alone with his thoughts and wounded pride. Emma began speaking in a respectful but firm voice, telling James the truth about how she saw him. She explained that in 2 years of work, he'd never known her name, never asked how she was, whether she had family or dreams. To him, she'd been invisible, a uniformed ghost who filled glasses and brought plates, but she had observed him. She'd seen how he treated people he considered inferior, watched his arrogance grow day by day. Tonight, she'd seen a man so rich in money and so poor in humanity that he couldn't even tolerate polite criticism of an undercooked dish. Emma's words were precise as scalpels, cutting without shouting, wounding without violence. James felt naked, exposed, seen for what he truly was. Emma continued, explaining that James believed money gave him the right to own people, but he was mistaken. Money had bought him the restaurant, expensive clothes, false respect from those who needed his money. but it hadn't bought him the right to trample on human dignity. Then came the phrase that broke something inside James. Emma told him the difference between them was that he had everything money could buy, but she had something he would never have: self-respect. James felt something collapse within him. It wasn't anger, it wasn't frustration, it was something deeper, the painful recognition of a truth he'd spent 42 years denying. Desperately, he tried to make amends by offering Emma a raise, but she smiled gently, explaining it wasn't about money, but dignity, and dignity had no price. When Emma revealed she had 2 university degrees, James was shocked. The woman who'd served his tables for 2 years was more educated than many of his guests. She'd worked for $7.50 an hour whilst dreaming of opening a restaurant, and he'd never noticed. To his question about why she'd never told him, Emma simply replied that he'd never asked. And even if he had, would he ever have taken seriously the waitress with 2 university degrees? James didn't know what to answer. He knew the answer was no. Emma untied her apron and placed it on the table with finality. Her parting words were a life lesson. The world was full of extraordinary people he considered invisible simply because they didn't wear expensive clothes. Perhaps it was time to start seeing them. And with those words, Emma Thompson left the Ivy Chelsea garden for the last time, leaving behind a millionaire who, for the first time in his life, wondered who he really was. The following days were the strangest of James Ashworth's life. For the first time in 42 years, he couldn't concentrate on business. Emma's words echoed in his head like a persistent echo, disrupting every activity. Sitting in his office on the 30th floor of a Canary Wharf tower he owned, he looked down at London and wondered how many other extraordinary people walked its streets without him noticing. How many other Emmas had he ignored in his race toward success? His employees noticed the change. James, usually imperious and demanding, seemed distracted, almost fragile. He no longer barked orders, didn't create scenes over minor delays. Something had shifted, but nobody could understand what. For the first time in his life, James began researching someone else without economic ulterior motives. He discovered Emma lived in a bedsit in Zone 4, sent part of her earnings to her ill mother in Yorkshire, had turned down better-paid job offers to stay near London where she hoped to realize her dream. He also discovered her final thesis in culinary arts had been on sustainability in modern gastronomy, a subject revealing authentic passion for the industry that went far beyond mere work. Emma wasn't just a waitress with 2 degrees. She was a visionary who dreamed of changing how people thought about food. But what struck James most was learning Emma had refused a management position at a restaurant chain because she preferred serving tables with dignity rather than managing without passion. This revelation was like a dagger to James's heart. Emma had chosen humility and authenticity over power and money. She'd done exactly the opposite of what he'd done his entire life. One evening, walking aimlessly through London streets, James found himself outside a small gastropub in Shoreditch. Through the window, he saw Emma serving tables, but her demeanor was completely different. She smiled genuinely, talked to customers like friends, transformed the simple act of serving into moments of human connection. James entered and sat at a corner table, hoping to go unnoticed. But Emma saw him immediately. For a moment, their eyes met. Then she approached with the same professional grace as always. James said he wanted to talk to her, and when she replied she was on duty but could recommend dishes, he ordered something at random. What he wanted was to find courage to say what he'd understood. When Emma returned with his meal, James stopped her by calling her name for the first time. He told her he was sorry for everything, for never seeing her, for thinking money gave him rights over his employees, for only discovering today that she was extraordinary. Emma sat beside him and asked what had really driven him to seek her out. James hesitated, then decided to be honest. That night, for the first time in his life, someone had shown him who he really was. and he hadn't liked what he'd seen. When Emma asked why her opinion should matter to him, James replied firmly that she was the first person he'd met who possessed something he couldn't buy, and he wanted to learn how to have it. 6 months after that conversation, in the small Shoreditch gastropub, both their lives had changed in unexpected ways. James had begun a process of personal transformation that led him to completely reconsider his priorities and values. The Ivy Chelsea garden still belonged to him, but he now managed it completely differently. He'd introduced fair wages for all employees, health care benefits, training programs. He'd transformed the restaurant from a symbol of arrogance into a model of ethical management. But the most significant change was personal. James had started seeing the people who worked for him, learning their names, their stories, their dreams. He'd discovered his driver dreamed of opening a driving school, his PA wrote poetry in her spare time, his building's porter painted extraordinary landscapes. Emma, meanwhile, had received a proposal that changed her life. James had offered her partnership in managing the Ivy Chelsea garden, not as an employee, but as an equal partner. He'd proposed transforming the restaurant according to her vision of sustainability and authenticity. Initially, Emma had refused, suspicious of James's motivations. But when he showed her contracts giving her 50% ownership of the restaurant without any investment from her, she understood the offer was sincere. James had explained he'd realized true success isn't measured by what you own, but by what you give, and she could give this place the soul he'd never managed to provide. The transformation of the Ivy Chelsea garden under James and Emma's joint direction became legendary. The restaurant retained its elegance, but acquired human warmth it had never possessed. The menu became sustainable, suppliers local, the atmosphere welcoming without losing refinement, but most importantly, it became a place where human dignity was respected at every level. Waiters were treated as professionals, customers as welcome guests, food as an expression of art and passion. A year later, the Ivy Chelsea garden received its second Michelin star, this time not for ostentatious luxury, but for authentic excellence in culinary and human experience. During the celebration evening, James rose to give a speech before journalists, food critics, and high society personalities. He said this star didn't belong to him, but to Emma Thompson, who'd had the courage to tell an arrogant man no and teach him that true success can't be bought with money. He turned to Emma and added that, a year ago, she'd told him dignity had no price. Now, he wanted to add that dignity is the only real capital worth accumulating. The applause that followed was the longest and most sincere the Ivy Chelsea garden had ever heard. But for Emma and James, true success wasn't in Michelin stars or applause. It was in the mutual respect they'd built, in the authentic transformation they'd lived, in proving that even people can change when they find someone willing to see them for what they could become. Emma had learned it's sometimes worth risking everything for your principles. James had learned that "nobody tells me no" is a phrase only fools utter. Because the best people in life are precisely those who have the courage to tell you no when you're wrong, and the wisdom to tell you yes when you deserve a second chance. Their restaurant became a symbol of how business can be conducted with ethics and humanity. But above all, it became living proof that when arrogance meets humility, and humility has the courage to speak up, something beautiful can be born. The humble waitress had given the arrogant millionaire the most precious lesson of his life, that true power doesn't consist of dominating others, but of bringing out the best in them. If this story touched your heart, smash that like button. Share in the comments. Have you ever had to say no to someone more powerful than you? Do you believe people can truly change? Subscribe and hit the bell for more stories showing how courage and dignity can change everything. Remember, Emma proved that nobody can buy us if we don't sell ourselves. Sometimes the most important lesson comes from the person you least expect.